Hollow footfalls echoing through empty corridors, the primal reaction of flesh brushed by an unseen touch, shadowy figures slipping between the moss-covered boles of ancient trees, strange calls issuing from not quite human throats, piercing the stillness of the night, unusual lights and objects streaming across darkened skies, stolen minutes, and a void filled with obscure and disturbing memories. These occurrences and more are called by many whispered names in many countries around a world we believe we know so well. All of these things share a common thread. I'm Charles Romans, and welcome to the pathways leading to the shadows of legend. The feet that leave their prints upon those pathways, of course, belong to the human race, our neighbors, our ancestors, and in some cases, our own. Some are quick and light, simply brushing the edges of those paths until brighter trails are found. Others are heavy and deep, leaving indelible marks on the memories of those who made them as they trod deeper along the darkened way. But all who travel, at some point, question, if only for the briefest of moments, whether or not we walk alone. Most of us would agree that it wouldn't be prudent to secure a guide who hasn't walked the path before us. And even if we need less of a guide and more of a companion, then we would all choose a companion whose steps march next to our own. This is especially true when we walk together on a lesser-known path, because people, after all, are social animals, and we find comfort in the presence of others. We enjoy sharing our lives and experiences, and from this sharing, stories are born. Those stories are both good and bad as life moves forward, chasing each sunrise. But some of those stories, the stories we tell one another in whispers or trembling tones, are shadows of those sunrises and become legends. We leave those legends in the form of tales that range from urban myths to accounts printed in dusty tomes or stored in databases in dozens of languages from dozens of different countries. I discovered these legends at an early age, scouring the shelves of libraries for accounts of ghosts, vampires, werewolves, and cryptids such as Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. The tales fascinated me and entertained me into the long hours of the night. You could say that, even though I was curled up on my bed beneath the covers under the light of an electric lamp, my feet were even then pacing the pathways with my mind's eye searching by torchlight through the shadows of legend. I had early guides myself, of course, Ivan Sanderson and Thomas Ellsworth among others, and my accomplices also included one of my earliest mentors who drove the bookmobile literally to the edge of my father's garage. Yes, Doug Rigsby, good or bad, this is all your fault. My own father, Franklin Romans, could spin a tale with the best of them, as they say, and he swore that his own mother was a witch. I had no proof of that, of course, and surely the sweet old lady who fed me treats on my infrequent visits was nothing more or less than she seemed. At least not that I remember. And then there was my mother's father, Benjamin Harrison Withrow, who could spin a story so fierce it would both raise and tangle the hairs at the nape of your neck. I still have a vivid mental picture of the tale he told me nearly 50 years ago of his encounter with a rabid dog in the woods behind his home. At least he said it was a dog, though the description might have been something else. I can still hear the saliva drip from its jaws as it turned eyes made sightless by rabies toward his hiding place behind a tree not nearly far enough away for him to have escaped. He also told a tale of a man who sold his soul to the devil for being able to play the fiddle. This was, of course, long before the Charlie Daniels song, and with a decidedly less happy ending. My grandfather has been dead for years, but I still remember him well. He was a small, thin man, nearly gaunt and bent by the weight of years and a hard life. He wore long-sleeved shirts, buttoned tightly at the wrist in all seasons, and more often than not, a light coat made thinner and shiny by years of use. He carried a cane he had carved himself, but seldom rested his weight upon it. "It's my walking stick," he'd explain when asked, and he carried that oak stick over every hill and hollow near his home in Rush, Kentucky. Though old and bent from care and arthritis, he couldn't bear to remain indoors. A friend of mine said he once encountered my grandfather miles back in the woods on an old logging road. My friend rounded a bend in the road cut around the side of the hill and there stood my grandfather. Harrison was just standing there on the road but not blocking it, my friend said. It was kind of creepy because it was like he was waiting for me, or maybe waiting for me to go past. My friend said he offered my grandfather a ride, but he refused and told him to be careful up there. As he drove away, my friend said he could see him through the rearview mirror, just standing in the same spot, watching him until another bend in the old dirt road made him lose sight of him. And this was not the only time people had seen my grandfather on foot, miles from well-traveled roads. Years before this instance occurred, long before my friend and I got our driver's licenses, I liked to climb the hill behind my father's garage. It seemed like within minutes you could walk far enough to be in a different world, and the sounds of cars and people just faded into silent whispers. The trees swayed pleasantly overhead, shading the hill, and the sound of insects and small forest creatures replaced the backfire of old gravel trucks and the barking of the neighbors' dogs. I did this frequently and enjoyed it immensely, because it seemed to clear my mind and let me think the deep thoughts of youth. It was peaceful like no other place I have been. I miss that sometimes. One day as I was returning from one of these walks, my grandfather met me at the foot of the hill. "Honey, you need to stay out from under those trees," he said flatly in his hoarse and rasping voice. I noticed that he seemed angry or worried. "Why, Grandpa?" I asked. "I watch for snakes and everything." "There's more than snakes up there," he told me. "There's wildcats and old mines a body could fall into and never be heard from again." Of course, that did nothing to change my mind, and in fact made the idea of looking through the woods even more exciting. But then he said something else that sticks with me to this day. "There's other things under those trees, boy. Things that don't need to be seen." When I started to ask another question, he just gripped my shoulder firmly in his bony old hand and began steering me toward the house. He didn't say another word until we were sitting on his porch, but on the way he kept looking back up the hillside that I had just returned from. Grandpa sat down in an old rocking chair on the porch and pulled a square of Brown's mule plug chewing tobacco out of his worn coat, then drew an old knife out of his trouser pocket. Looking out across the road and into the opposite hill beyond, his fingers skillfully shaved off a quarter-sized chunk, and he slid it off the knife blade into his mouth. He chewed for several moments, collecting his thoughts before he spoke. "I've been over these hills and back more times than I can count," he told me. "Been doing it since Becky, my mother, was your age, and I seen a lot of things," he said. "Some of them I wish I hadn't seen, and others I had no business seeing," he said just above a whisper. Then he fell silent for a long time, deep in thoughts I was afraid to interrupt. "Honey, for your old papaw's sake, you got to stay out from under those trees," he said at last, and before I could protest, he began to tell me a story. "I wasn't much older than you when this time happened," he began in a hoarse whisper as his memories became words. "I was out under the trees walking around, but I was being quiet because I was throwing rocks at squirrels. Never hit a single one," he said with a ghost of a smile. "But it was good fun for a young boy with no better sense, and I liked to hear them fuss back at me. But I hadn't seen one in a bit and was getting bored, so I was thinking about heading back. Good thing I hadn't seen one in a while, or I wouldn't have heard it coming over the chatter." "What was it, Grandpa?" I blurted out excitedly, but he just held up a wrinkled, bony hand, and I fell back into a fidgety silence. "I knew something bigger than a squirrel or rabbit was coming, so I slipped over behind this big tree and hunkered down. I thought I was going to get lucky and see a wildcat, but this wasn't no cat. No," my grandpa said in that hoarse voice. "It wasn't no cat at all. I heard a noise kind of like a creaking and crackling, and heard the leaves crunching under its big feet a few seconds before I saw it come shambling between the trees. It was big," he said. "Biggest damn dog I ever did see, and all black and shaggy, with the hair matted in some spots and thin in others like it had the mange. Its mouth was open," he said, caught in the throes of memory, "and foam dripped from it like rain as it swung its head from side to side. I knew then that the thing was eat up with rabies, and I knew, too, that if I made a single noise, if I would so much as breathe, that I was as good as dead." I froze behind that big old beech tree, and let me tell you, honey, I prayed to the good Lord to hide me. But the thing kept creeping closer to me, swaying and stumbling with that awful cracking noise, like its own bones didn't quite fit the hiding muscle they were under. And then its head turned toward me, and it looked me right into the eyes. And I don't mind to admit, I was so scared I almost passed out. And maybe I would have at that if I hadn't noticed the film over its eyes, all white and milky. Rabies or God in heaven had blinded that thing so it couldn't see me, he told me with a massive sigh. But it could still smell and hear, he said. That big black nose wrinkled as it sucked in air, and those lips curled back from the biggest teeth I had ever seen, my grandfather said, reliving the terror of the thing himself. Yellow they were, and they looked to be as long as my smallest finger. There was a mouthful of them coming up out of blackened gums, and I just knew if it got a hold of me, it could bite my arm clean off. And the foam from the rabies dripped off every one of them, and I could hear it hit the leaves on the ground. It took another step or two toward me, and then a low growl started somewhere deep inside its belly when it somehow figured out I was there. Child, I knew I was a heartbeat from dying. There was nowhere for me to run, and no time to get there before that thing would bring me down. It was so close I could smell the awful smell of rotten meat, like the rabies had killed the thing a long time ago, and it had just refused to fall over. I started begging God to let me live, or at least that my parents would somehow find out what had happened to me so they wouldn't wonder over it and grieve forever. And then there was this noise deeper in the woods that sounded just before the thing reached that old beech tree. It was the sort of sound you'd hear if you put a bark and a yelp together, and that thing's ears pricked up. Then it turned and shambled off on those shaking, creaking legs and was gone. Honey, I could have been a few minutes or an hour before I stopped shaking enough to walk. But as soon as I was able, I got out of there. And it was a long time before I ever went back under the trees. But it's best if you stay out from under the trees altogether. The good Lord brought me out of there, and then when I told my dad what I'd seen, he switched me real good to teach me a lesson. But you know, I seem to remember him weeping as he did. I couldn't sleep for weeks after that, my grandfather told me, and that had nothing to do with the switch marks. As I reflected on that story and the others that I heard from my grandfather, as well as those I heard from numerous other people, my rational mind began to dissect them and to question. In the case of my grandfather, was it simply a tale spun from the fertile mind of a natural storyteller, intended perhaps to scare his grandchild enough to keep him safe? Or was it his account of the dangers of a wild, perhaps rabid animal he had encountered while alone in the woods he wanted to keep me out of? But those considerations aside, there were still other questions. My grandfather, like most from his generation, was a hunter and a fisherman. He knew animals, and he knew dogs especially. From my own personal experience, I had seen him identify the breed of a dog in a field 50 yards away in tall grass. In this tale, he identified the animal only as the biggest dog he'd ever seen. Why didn't he identify it as a German Shepherd or a Lab or a Chow? And to the best of my recollection, he only used the word dog once. So if this wasn't a total fabrication for my benefit, just what was the creature my grandfather encountered under the trees? And why did it move as though its bones didn't match its hide and muscle? And what was the call from deeper in the woods that drew it from the helpless prey at hand? Unfortunately, I wasn't able to ask him these questions before he passed. Now, my grandfather swore his stories were all true, either ones he had witnessed firsthand or had been from reliable sources, he said. I had no proof, of course. Most of these had happened decades before I was born, naturally, because he had been a young man when he had heard or experienced them. And whether he intended to be or not, he had become part of a grand centuries-old tradition of oral storytelling. This tradition was alive and well in the rural Appalachian area where I grew up. And eastern Kentucky has always claimed a wealth of strange stories about ghosts and devils and creatures best left in the woods. As I grew older, I continued to read voraciously, devouring every legend and myth that I could discover. Tales such as the one of the Cossack returning home from war, only to be drawn into a pitched battle with a night creature scant miles from his homeland. Or the one about the man who learned, to his sorrow, that not only was his loving wife a witch, but had begun their young daughter upon that dark path as well. And as I read these tales and more, I shared the desperate exhilaration of the hunter who was attacked by a tiger and only survived by cutting off one of its paws. I also shared the hunter's horror when he examined the paw later with his friend, only to discover the deadly claws had become a slender woman's manicured hand. These legends came from around the globe, of course, like the African tale of the warrior who was determined to defeat Death's brother, Sleep. This was an amusing tale, ending with the warrior admitting defeat once he realized that sleep did him no harm, and culminating in the desire to simply live with the spirit who robbed him of a fraction of his life. And then there was the infamous story of Faust, who sold his soul to the devil for material gratification. This story, as you may know, ended horrifically with Faust's body shredded by demonic beasts and cast upon a dung heap. These two tales are radically different, of course, but I began to notice striking similarities in most of the tales I read, or at least a recurrence of basic themes. The basic type of creatures could be found in every region of the world, though tailored to their individual environments. The Sasquatch of the North Americas and the Yeti of the Himalayas could be said to be the same breed. Evil spirits did evil things, whether in desecrated churches in Europe or in shrines in mainland China. In today's world, this is thought to be unsurprising. But remember that there was no contact between the Himalayas and the North American continent as little as 300 years ago. So how were these legends so similar? The answers, I believe, are as elusive as the legends themselves. Perhaps more importantly, the legends not only persist after countless generations, but continue to grow. People still report sightings of cryptids such as Bigfoot, the Mothman, and the Jersey Devil. Ghosts still whisper in the lonely places of the world, calling to whatever ears might strain to hear their message from beyond the grave. Still, as always, proof is as elusive as the ether through which they float. And there are those who report not only seeing extraterrestrial beings, but give accounts of abductions by them. And I believe, at the end of the day, it would be naive to think that every report was submitted by the mentally deranged or charlatans seeking glory. They are shadows, yes, but there is a high possibility that something substantial exists somewhere to cast those shadows. On that note, I will begin by offering some proof of my own. This occurred while I was interviewing a paranormal group several years ago for the newspaper. It is what is referred to as an EVP, an electronic voice phenomena, and it was captured while I recorded the interview. At around 4 minutes, you will hear something that doesn't belong on that audio recording. To myself and those present, it is proof, and you perhaps might agree. Listen carefully.
For various reasons.
Right.
And a lot of that is intent.
I didn't hear the voice during the interview, and it was only while playing it back on the computer in my home office while writing the article that I catch it. I was stunned, so I backed it up and let it play again with the same results.
And a lot of that is intent.
I backed it up a second time and asked my wife to come into the office. She took a seat, then hit play on the recording.
A lot of that is...
Her reaction was instantaneous and extreme. "My God, that's your mother's voice," she said, confirming what I believed I had heard. I just nodded. My mother had been dead for over a year. Now that you have heard it, I can tell you that this is proof. Some will believe, while others will instantly refute it. They will say the audio was doctored, or they will say that someone who hadn't spoken before on the recording called my name. And though I myself am telling you that this was an unmanipulated recording, and that the owner of that voice was not present, there is no video to support that. Still, though it may not be empirical evidence that removes any doubt, it is compelling evidence nonetheless. In many cases, this is the best proof that is available. leaving us to decide for ourselves just what to believe. This is Charles Romans, and on behalf of myself and our guests, thank you for joining us on this walk through the shadows of legend. If you like what you heard, please follow us and visit our website at shadowsoflegend.com and support our Patreon page to help keep the content flowing. And if you would like to be a guest and share your own brush with a stranger paranormal, don't hesitate to email us and include a contact number. The strange and surreal, the normal and the paranormal are all aspects of the world in which we live. As you reflect upon the stories we have shared, keep in mind that the people sharing these stories are actual, real people just like us. Were the stories shared compelling enough to be given credibility, or should they be relegated to the deeper part of the shadows? But when determining this, it might be a good idea to keep an open mind, because when we look around, we might discover that our own world is less brightly lit than we once thought. Until next time, I'll be waiting for you in the shadows of legend.